It's you got to stay strong and loving for yourself and walk away when the time is right and not waste too much time on. I'd be here to feel empowered and be hopeful for my future, and if it shows.
We got it wrong. Not some of it, not the parts that were inconvenient or the parts that aged badly. All of it. This channel, the critics, TLC, the comment sections, the fan accounts, the industry press, every single platform that has ever generated an opinion about Darcey Silva has gotten something fundamentally wrong about her. And the reason it took 39 episodes to say that out loud is because the wrong version of the story was more accessible than the correct one. And accessibility in the content economy functions as a kind of truth even when it is not. So here is what we are doing today. We are tearing up the document, not the evidence. The evidence was real, and the analysis was honest, and the documentation was accurate. But evidence and accuracy and documentation are not the whole story of a person. They are the part that leaves a paper trail. And the part that does not leave a paper trail was, in Darcey's case, always the most important part. If this kind of deep dive accountability content is what you come here for, please hit like and subscribe right now. This channel exists because of viewers who want the full picture, not just the highlight reel, and this episode is the fullest picture we have ever attempted. The trap that everyone fell into, and I mean everyone from TLC's production offices to the most thoughtful corners of the fan community to this channel's own analytical framework, was the format trap. And the format trap is so specific, so quietly consequential, and so rarely named that it is worth spending real time on before we get to the verdict. Here is how it works. You encounter a story. The story has a person at its center. The person's choices, circumstances, and outcomes generate content, footage, commentary, reaction, analysis. And somewhere in the process of generating that content, you stop asking what the story is and start asking how the story fits the format you already have ready. TLC had a format: drama, escalation, resolution, repeat. The critics had a format: public figure hubris, visible crack, full collapse, replacement. The fan community had a format: parasocial intimacy that required the subject to be simultaneously your closest friend and your most reliable entertainment, available at all times and grateful for the attention. This channel had a format: the self-sabotage arc, the irony spiral, the point of no return. Every one of those formats captured something real about something real in Darcey's story. The drama was real. The hubris was real, in places. The self-sabotage was real. The points of no return were real. The evidence was genuine, and the patterns were documented, and none of the analysis was fabricated. But here is what none of the formats could accommodate: the fact that the person inside the story was too internally contradictory, too specifically human, too genuinely complex to be fully contained by any of them. The format's capture was never the story's completion. The story was always bigger than the available room, and the person inside the story was always more than the format could hold. That is not a minor oversight. That is the central error of a decade of coverage. And the error started, at the very beginning. At the casting process, there is a document, referenced across multiple episodes of this series, that the production team used to evaluate potential cast members for the franchise. It scored candidates on specific emotional and behavioral characteristics: external validation dependency, high; romantic idealism, high; emotional expressiveness, high; willingness to be vulnerable on camera, very high. Darcey Silva, by every account of everyone who has ever been willing to discuss it, scored at or near the maximum on every characteristic the format required. She was, in the specific language of commercial reality television production, ideal. And here is what nobody on that production team apparently considered. The characteristics that make someone ideal for the format are the same characteristics that make the format expensive for the person. External validation dependency does not make good television because it is a neutral quirk. It makes good television because it creates visible, dramatic, emotionally legible behavior, the kind of behavior that keeps viewers engaged and advertisers paying. But external validation dependency is not a television characteristic. It is a human characteristic. It has a history. It has origins. It has costs. and the costs do not stay on screen when the cameras stop rolling. TLC identified Darcey Silva's most human, most vulnerable, most costly characteristics, and then built a commercial infrastructure designed to amplify them to the maximum possible scale. The show extracted a decade of emotional labor from her, genuine emotional labor, real feelings publicly displayed, actual vulnerability commercially packaged, and compensated her with a fraction of the value that labor generated. The franchise revenue from Darcey's storylines alone, advertising, streaming licensing, merchandise, the broader brand equity that her name contributed to building, is not a number that appears on any of her checks. The industry built something valuable on her willingness to feel things in front of cameras. And then, when the human being behind the brand became complicated, when the visible vulnerability started requiring accommodation rather than just extraction, the industry started looking at replacements. That is what TLC got wrong. Not the casting. The casting was accurate. The scoring was right. She was exactly what the format needed. What TLC got wrong was the assumption, the catastrophically expensive assumption, that a person can sustain being a format indefinitely, that you can commercially extract someone's most human qualities at scale, and the person will remain fully intact and endlessly available for further extraction. That the characteristics the formula ran on were renewable resources rather than finite human reserves. They are not renewable. They are not infinite. And the industry that consumed them is only now, belatedly, beginning to reckon with what the consumption cost. But TLC getting it wrong is the expected part of this story. The part that is harder to reckon with, the part that this series has to be honest about, is that the critics and the community got it wrong in a different, and in some ways more consequential way. The critics applied the decline narrative. The decline narrative has a specific structure. The public figure rises on the strength of something genuine, reaches a visible peak, begins the descent through a series of documented failures, arrives at the bottom, and either achieves redemption or disappears. It is a satisfying narrative. It has a shape. It produces clean analytical content. And it was applied to Darcey Silva's public life with such consistency by so many outlets and commentators and YouTube channels, including this one, that the application itself started to function as evidence. If enough people are using the decline framework to describe someone's trajectory, the framework starts to feel accurate even when it is not. The repetition becomes its own kind of proof. And the problem with the decline narrative as applied to Darcey is not that it captured nothing. It captured real things, documented crises, genuine low points, consequential choices made in difficult circumstances. The problem is that decline narratives require the decline to be the end point. They require the story to be going in one direction. And Darcey's story was never going in one direction. It was going in several directions simultaneously, and the directions that were going up, quietly, without cameras, without comment section documentation, were invisible to a framework that was only looking for dissent. The manuscript is the clearest evidence of this. The existence of a completed, substantive, significantly more intelligent piece of writing than anyone who had watched only the television programming would have predicted. That single piece of evidence should have collapsed the decline narrative immediately. Instead, the reaction was telling. The reaction was not a revision of the framework. The reaction was surprising. Widespread, viral, 2 million likes surprise. The comment that captured the moment, and it captures it precisely, was some version of, "I didn't know she was this smart." That comment, in its honesty, contains the full record of what the criticism got wrong. I did not know. It was assumed. And the assumption was shaped entirely by a framework that needed her to be simpler than she was. The internet's specific error is worth naming precisely because it is the most consequential one in terms of the public record, and public records have a way of outlasting the people they misrepresent. The internet decided, early in Darcey's public life, that she was not intelligent, that the emotional expressiveness, the visible investment in relationships that produced painful outcomes, the romantic idealism that persisted in the face of evidence, the external validation seeking that was dramatic and public and available for commentary, that these things were evidence of limited sophistication. The condescension had a specific texture, the exhausted disbelief of audiences watching someone make choices they would not make, arriving at the conclusion that the person making the choices was less capable than they were. This is a conflation, and it is a conflation so common, so deeply embedded in the way public figures get assessed, that it rarely gets named. Emotional intelligence and self-protective intelligence are not the same capacity. They are not even adjacent capacities. Someone can have profound emotional intelligence, a genuine ability to perceive, process, and respond to the emotional content of human experience, and simultaneously have underdeveloped self-protective intelligence, the capacity to guard your own interior from the consequences of that openness. These are different things. The internet conflated them and arrived at a wrong verdict. The woman whose romantic choices looked, from the outside, like a pattern of unsophisticated decision-making was not making unsophisticated decisions in the emotional sense. She was making the decisions of someone whose capacity to feel and to invest and to hope was operating at a level that her capacity to protect herself from the costs of feeling and investing and hoping could not match. That gap between emotional generosity and self-protective capacity is not stupidity. It is, in fact, one of the more recognizable markers of a specific kind of emotional intelligence. The people who feel the most deeply are frequently the people who protect themselves the least effectively, not because they are incapable of self-protection, because the same openness that makes them feel deeply also makes them resistant to the emotional shutdowns that self-protection requires. The panel answer demonstrated this. The manuscript proved it. The 4-hour conversation evidenced it. The 90-minute unproduced interview, which the few people who have seen it describe uniformly as the most articulate account of her own psychology that Darcey has ever given, confirmed it completely. She was always significantly more intelligent than the choices she made in the romantic sphere appeared. The internet arrived at that conclusion 2 million likes at a time when the manuscript surfaced. But the conclusion was available from the beginning to anyone who was not using a framework that required her to be limited. Now, the behavioral verdict, the honest one, the one that the evidence actually supports across 39 episodes of documentation, rather than the one that the format required. Darcey Silva has genuine strengths that every format that covers her is systematically undervalued, and I want to name them specifically because naming them generically would be its own form of condescension. Her warmth is not performed. This is not an obvious thing to say about someone whose life has been filmed for a decade in environments specifically designed to elicit performance. But the evidence across 39 episodes consistently distinguishes between Darcey's performed warmth, which exists, which is real, which is commercially useful, and her genuine warmth, which operates even when there is nothing to be gained from it, which is evident in the private account record, and the conversations that were never meant to be documented, and the relationships that built on her as a person, rather than as a brand. Genuine warmth is not the same as performed warmth. Hers is both. The genuine version was always the more interesting story. Her creative intelligence is real and was consistently obscured by the performance layer. The manuscript is the clearest evidence, but it is not the only evidence. The business construction, the diversified revenue model that was built quietly while the public attention was on the drama, required strategic intelligence of a specific and undervalued kind. The brand partnerships, the product development, the platform diversification, the revenue streams that did not depend on TLC's continued interest in her story, these did not happen by accident, and they did not happen because someone else built them for her. They happened because the woman the internet decided was not sophisticated enough to protect herself, financially turned out to be building financial infrastructure that the internet had no idea existed. The quiet competence and the loud drama were happening simultaneously. The loud drama was documented. The quiet competence was not, and the silence of the documentation was mistaken for the silence of the capacity. Her capacity for genuine change is real, and this is the one the format of decline narratives specifically cannot accommodate. Decline narratives require the subject to either achieve a single redemption arc or disappear. They cannot accommodate the slower, messier, more authentically human process of actual change, the kind that happens in increments, that produces setbacks, that looks from the outside like the same old pattern while being, from the inside, significantly different. The evidence across the final episodes of this series is consistent. Something changed. The change is not a television redemption arc. It does not have a clear before and after and a triumphant musical cue. It is the kind of change that happens when a person has enough information about their own patterns to start making choices based on that information rather than despite it. The pattern is not gone. The vulnerabilities are not resolved. But the relationship to the pattern is different. And a different relationship to a pattern is not the same as the same pattern. It is worth saying that out loud because the format cannot. The genuine vulnerabilities deserve the same specificity. The external validation dependency is real. It is consequential. It has produced choices that cost her significantly, professionally, personally, publicly. But context is not an excuse, and naming the context does not eliminate the behavioral reality. The context is this. The external validation dependency developed in a specific emotional history long before the cameras arrived and was then systematically amplified by a commercial system that needed it to be as pronounced as possible because a more pronounced version made better television. The system identified the characteristic, amplified it commercially, extracted value from the amplified version, and then watched from a comfortable distance while the person living with the amplified characteristic dealt with the amplified consequences. The dependency is real. The commercial amplification of the dependency is also real. Both are true. The full picture requires both. The insight without integration pattern is a recognized psychological dynamic and not a Darcy-specific character failing, and it is worth naming precisely because it was so often treated as the latter. The capacity to understand your own patterns, to articulate them clearly, to identify their origins, to describe their consequences with accuracy, does not automatically produce the capacity to change the behavior the patterns generate. These are different cognitive and emotional operations. Someone can have complete and accurate insight into exactly why they do the things they do and still do those things, not because the insight is insufficient, but because insight and integration are different steps and the distance between them is longer and harder to travel than it appears from outside the person doing the traveling. The commentary that read this pattern as performance, as evidence that the self-knowledge was not genuine because genuine self-knowledge would produce visible change immediately, missed the psychology entirely. The insight was real. The gap between insight and integration was real. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. Now, the part of the verdict that this channel owes directly. The specific accounting for what this series got wrong. The self-sabotage format was applied with genuine rigor and genuine analytical care. The irony was documented accurately. The contradictions were real. The escalating stakes were not invented or exaggerated. But analytical rigor and honest documentation do not automatically produce a complete picture of a person. They produce a complete picture of the part of a person that generates documentable evidence. And the part of Darcy that generated the most documentable evidence was, by design, by the design of the commercial system she was embedded in, the part that was most in conflict, most visible, most publicly consequential. The camera followed the drama. The analysis followed the camera. And the interior, the private account version, the Tuesday confession, the 4-hour conversation, the 90-minute interview that never aired, the manuscript that nobody outside a small circle knew existed, that was not in the frame. It was not in the frame partly because access was limited, partly because the format did not have room for it, and partly because, and this is the hardest part to say, the analytical frame found what it was looking for. When you are applying a self-sabotage framework, you find self-sabotage. When you are documenting irony, you find irony. The evidence was real, but the frame shaped which evidence was prioritized. And the evidence that did not fit the frame, the quiet competence, the genuine growth, the intelligence that surfaced in context the cameras did not reach, was underweighted not because it was less real, but because it was less legible through the available lens. This series owes her the acknowledgement that the analytical frame had a bias, and that the bias was toward the documentable, and that the documentable was not the complete story, and that the complete story was always more complicated and more interesting and more human than the documentation captured. That acknowledgement is not a retraction. The documentation was accurate, but accuracy and completeness are different things. And for a decade, the accurate version was available, and the complete version was not. The complete version deserved better. The accountability piece, and it belongs to everyone, not just this series, is the audience piece. Everyone who consumed content about Darcey Silva's life extracted something from the consumption: the entertainment value, the community of shared commentary, the specific comfort of watching someone else's visible struggles from a safe distance, the validation of your own choices against the backdrop of someone else's more dramatic ones. These are real things that real audiences receive from this kind of content, and they are received without a full accounting of the cost to the person at the center of it. We asked for authenticity. She gave authenticity. The authenticity was real, and it was difficult, and it was publicly documented, and it was commercially exploited, and audiences consumed it, and the consumption generated more demand for more authenticity, and the cycle ran on the reserves of a single human being who was simultaneously trying to live a life inside the content being generated about it. The task was enormous. The compensation, in every sense, financial, emotional, communal, was insufficient. And the specific failure of the audience is the same as the specific failure of the format. We mistook the consumption for an equal exchange. It was not an equal exchange. The person at the center of the content paid more than everyone who watched it combined. That is the structural reality of the parasocial economy. It is not a reason to stop watching. It is a reason to watch with a different kind of awareness. Awareness of what the watching costs. The final isolation verdict is the one that the evidence, across all 39 episodes, most consistently and most heartbreakingly points toward. And it points there not because it is the darkest reading of the available evidence, but because it is the most accurate one. Darcey Silva spent a decade being the most watched person in any room she entered, and feeling, by multiple documented accounts and by the most honest readings of her own statements across years of interviews, the least seen, not the least watched, the most watched. But watching is not seeing. The audience was not connected. The follower count was not community. The validation that arrived in the form of comments and likes and fan accounts and parasocial devotion was not the love it resembled from a distance. The platform did not belong, and the performance of intimacy that reality television requires, the opening of the interior for public consumption, the displaying of vulnerability as entertainment, the systematic blurring of the line between private feeling and public content, produced something that looked like connection from every angle except the interior of the person performing it. She was looking for love, specifically, precisely, the kind that does not require an audience to validate it, the kind that does not need a production team in the corner to sustain it, the kind that is, at its most essential, just two people who know the full version of each other, the Chapter 7 version, the private account version, the Tuesday confession version, the 90-minute unproduced interview version, and choose each other based on that full knowledge, rather than based on the edited, produced, commercially optimized version. She spent a decade looking for that specific thing inside formats that were structurally incapable of producing it. Formats that could produce drama and engagement and audience investment and advertising revenue, but not the specific quiet recognition that she was actually looking for. Based on everything this series has documented, and based on the parts of the documentation that point most clearly toward what happened after the cameras found less to follow, she is beginning to find it in the places that have no cameras, in the relationships that are not generating content, in the version of her life that is not available for comment section analysis. Slowly, at real cost, with the specific difficulty of someone who spent years in public light, suddenly learning to value what happens in private darkness, but finding it, and that resolution, slow, costly, unglamorous, entirely unfilmable, is the only ending worth delivering. The complete and honest verdict, after 39 episodes and across every category of crisis and recovery and documentation and analysis and correction, is this: Darcey Silva is a person of genuine intelligence, genuine warmth, genuine creative capacity, and genuine human complexity, who was identified by a commercial system for the specific emotional characteristics that made her useful to that system. She was placed in an environment designed to amplify those characteristics at commercial scale. She was compensated with a fraction of the value that amplification generated. She was evaluated, by the system, by its audience, by the critics, by this channel, against standards that the system itself made impossible to meet. The patterns were real. The crises were real. The consequences were real. The behavior that generated documentation was documented accurately. And so is everything else. The recovery is real. The intelligence the comment section did not know about is real. The manuscript is real. The quiet competence is real. The 4-hour conversation is real. The person who was always there behind the performance, the version that no format had room for, that no analysis could fully reach, that no documentation could completely capture, has always been real. The format never had room for the full version. She made the room herself, at significant personal cost, across a significant period of time, in the face of significant institutional resistance. She made room for herself inside a machine that was built to use her and not to see her, and the making of that room is the most impressive thing this series has documented. Not the ratings, not the viral moments, not the feuds or the crises or the comeback arcs or any of the content that the format required. The making of room for the full version of herself inside a machine that never intended to provide it. That is the verdict. That is the complete story and the final word. And this series has always known this, from the first episode. The final word belongs to her. Subscribe. The last episode is coming, and you do not want to miss it.